They said the first breath after a coma would feel like being born again, but mine felt like choking on memories. White ceilings, machines beeping like broken promises, nurses whispering like ghosts. I blinked through 2 years of silence, expecting her face, hoping, even after everything. But it wasn't her waiting. It was my lawyer. He held my hand tighter than she ever did, and whispered the truth like a knife through stitched skin. She moved on, a year ago, with your best friend. I tried to laugh, my throat only burned. 2 years. Tubes in my lungs, feeding through wires, dreaming of her voice like it was the only thing keeping me alive. Turns out, the only person fighting for me was the one I nearly cut off, my sister. The one she said was jealous, paranoid, bitter. But bitter is what you become when the man you love ends up a trophy in someone else's success story. And now, here I am. Heels clicking down the hallway, paperwork in my hand, ring still on my finger, gown barely covering my back. But I'm not walking home. I'm walking into court. If she let me die emotionally when I was still breathing, then I'll let her watch me live, in silence, in strength, and without ever looking back. The light carved through my eyelids like a blade made of mourning, sharp and unforgiving. I tried to turn away, but my body, this vessel I once knew, felt foreign, weighted down by months of stillness. The fluorescent hum above me was a cruel lullaby, singing me awake to a world I no longer recognized. 2 years. The number floated in the sterile air like dust motes, settling into the cracks of my consciousness. 2 years of darkness. 2 years of dreams that felt more real than this moment, where her voice still echoed in the chambers of my heart, whispering my name like a sacred hymn. But the bed beside me was empty. Cold. The indent where her head should have rested was smooth, untouched by memory or warmth. My fingers searched the sheets, desperate for some trace of her, a strand of hair, the ghost of her perfume, anything to prove that the love we shared wasn't just another fever dream. Instead, I found only the rough texture of hospital linens and the bitter taste of abandonment coating my tongue. Machines beeped around me like mechanical heartbeats, counting seconds I'd lost, minutes I'd never reclaim. The IV needle in my arm felt like an anchor, tethering me to this harsh reality where love apparently had an expiration date. You're awake. My sister's voice cut through the haze, soft but edged with something I couldn't name. Relief? Guilt? Margaret stood in the doorway like a sentinel, her face a map of sleepless nights and worry lines I'd never seen before. She looked older, we both did, I supposed, though I'd spent my aging in dreams while she'd worn hers in the waking world. Where is she? The words scraped against my throat like broken glass. Even speaking her name felt dangerous now, as if uttering it might shatter what little remained of the man I used to be. Margaret's eyes, those same green eyes we shared from our mother, filled with something that looked luscious. Ike pity. She stepped closer, her footsteps echoing in the silence that stretched between us like a chasm. Margaret began, then stopped, her hands twisted together, fingers interlacing and releasing like she was trying to weave words that wouldn't cut so deep. She stopped coming after the first year. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was the absence of everything. No protestations of love, no explanations, no desperate justifications. Just the mechanical breathing of machines and the hollow echo of a truth that tasted like ashes. 1 year, 365 days of waiting, and then, nothing. I closed my eyes, but the darkness behind my lids was different now. It wasn't the peaceful void of unconsciousness, it was the black hole where hope used to live. In that space, I could still see her face from our wedding day, radiant and promising forever with lips that shaped words like, "Until death do us part." But death hadn't parted us. Life had. The doctors said. Margaret's voice wavered, each word carefully chosen like stepping stones across a raging river. They said you might not remember everything at first, that some memories might be difficult. Memory. As if forgetting could be a mercy. As if the heart could develop amnesia along with the brain, but every beat of my chest remembered her laugh, every breath recalled. The way she used to trace my collarbone with her fingertips on Sunday mornings, every blink brought back the promise in her eyes when she said she'd wait for me. She'd lied. Or maybe I'd died after all, and this was purgatory, a place where love letters turned to dust and vows became empty echoes in hospital rooms that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. Rain began to tap against the window like fingers drumming an impatient rhythm. The storm outside matched the one brewing in my chest, where anger and heartbreak swirled together like paint on a palette, creating something new and terrible. Margaret reached for my hand, her touch warm and real and present. "You're alive," she whispered, as if she could resurrect more than just my body with those two words. "You're here." But as I stared at the empty space where my wife should have been, I wondered if being alive and being truly living were the same thing. The machines continued their relentless counting, marking time in a world where I was apparently already a ghost, breathing, but buried nonetheless. The newspapers arrived like harbingers of apocalypse, crisp and innocent in their morning freshness. Margaret had suggested them for reorientation, as if reading about a world that had spun on without me could somehow anchor me back to reality. But reality, I discovered, was far crueler than any nightmare my unconscious mind had conjured. The headlines blurred together: politics, weather, celebrity scandals, until my eyes caught something that made my heart forget how to beat. There, splashed across the lifestyle section in glossy, devastating clarity, was her face, my wife, my beautiful, radiant wife. But she wasn't mine anymore. The white dress she wore wasn't the vintage lace we'd picked out together for our vow renewals that never came. This was silk and satin and designer dreams, flowing around her like liquid starlight as she smiled at a man who used to call me brother. Destination wedding of the year, the caption read with cheerful oblivion. Local business owner finds love again, after tragic loss. Tragic loss. As if I were already buried, already mourned, already forgotten. My hands shook as I held the paper closer, searching her face for some sign of the woman who used to trace my jaw and whisper that I was her forever. But her smile was different now, brighter, perhaps, or maybe just emptier of the weight she used to carry when she looked at me. The groom stood beside her with his arm possessively around her waist, and I recognized every feature of his face with sickening clarity. David. My best friend since college. The man who'd stood at my hospital bedside in those first desperate weeks, gripping my unresponsive hand and promising, swearing, that he'd keep her strong until I came back. He'd kept his promise, hadn't he? Just not in the way either of us had imagined. The article was brief, sanitized, perfect for public consumption. It mentioned her previous marriage to accident victim, in passing, like a footnote to a tragedy that had already reached its conclusion. Comments were disabled, a small mercy that somehow felt like the cruelest cut of all. "Sir?" The nurse's voice drifted from the doorway, soft and cautious. "Is everything all right?" I looked up at her, this stranger who'd been caring for my body while my soul shattered, and tried to form words. "Is it true?" The question came out as barely more than breath. "The newspaper. Is it real?" Her face told me everything before her silence could. The way her eyes darted away, the unconscious step backward, the sudden interest in her clipboard, all of it screamed confirmation louder than any words could have. I tried to scream then, tried to tear the paper, throw it across the room, rage against the cosmic joke that had stolen 2 years of my life only to gift them to another man. But my voice had been stolen along with everything else, and all that emerged was a sound so small and broken it might have been mistaken for a sigh. One tear, that's all my body could manage, one single, scalding drop that traced a path down my cheek like liquid fire. "She waited a year," I whispered to the empty air, repeating the words I'd heard Margaret speak yesterday like a mantra. That's what she told everyone. A year, 12 months, 365 days of grief before she decided love had an expiration date and moved on to fresher feelings with a familiar face. But I had died every single day in that darkness. Every moment of unconsciousness had been an eternity of dreams where she was still mine, still waiting, still whispering promises into the space between sleeping and waking. I had died 1,000 deaths while she grieved me once and buried me forever. The newspaper slipped from my fingers like autumn leaves, settling on the sterile floor with a whisper of finality. In the margins of the wedding announcement, I could see other stories: births, deaths, celebrations, sorrows, all the life that had continued while mine had paused. She hadn't paused with me. She'd kept dancing while I lay still, found new music while my song played in silence, discovered new love while mine waited in the dark like a faithful dog that never learned its master wasn't coming home. The machines around me beeped their mechanical lullabies, counting heartbeats that felt increasingly meaningless. Outside the window, rain had begun to fall again, each drop a tiny funeral for the man I used to be. She'd buried me once, but somehow, I was still breathing. Margaret placed my old phone in my hands like she was passing me a loaded weapon. The familiar weight of it, sleek, black, scarred from 1,000 casual drops, felt heavier than memory should allow. She'd kept it charged all this time, she said, preserved like a relic in a shrine to a man who'd never really died. The password was still the same. Our anniversary date, punched in with muscle memory, my fingers remembered even when my heart tried to forget. The screen bloomed to life, icons and apps arranged exactly as I'd left them 2 years ago, frozen in time like everything else about the life I used to live. I scrolled through with trembling thumbs, past photos of us that now felt like archaeological evidence, past text messages that read like love letters from the dead. And then I found it, buried in a folder I'd never seen before, uploaded to a cloud account I didn't remember sharing. A video, her video. The thumbnail showed her face, bright and determined, sitting in what looked like our bedroom, my bedroom, I corrected myself with bitter precision. The timestamp read day 82, and my heart clenched as I realized she'd been counting. Counting days like a prisoner marking time until freedom. I pressed play with a finger that shook like autumn leaves. "Hi everyone," her voice chirped through the tiny speakers, that familiar melody that used to sing me to sleep now cutting through me like broken glass. "It's day 82 since the accident, and he's still not waking up. But the doctors say I have to keep living, you know, for both of us." Her smile was radiant, rehearsed, perfect for the camera. Behind her, I could see the edge of our wedding photo on the nightstand, still facing her side of the bed, still watching over her sleep like a guardian ghost. I scrolled forward, my heart hammering against my ribs like something desperate to escape. Day 143. Her hair was different now. Shorter, more daring. The background had changed too. No longer our bedroom but some club, neon lights painting her face in electric blues and poisonous greens. "So I went out tonight," she laughed, and the sound was lighter somehow, less weighted with grief. "My therapist says I need to reconnect with joy, and you know what? I think she's right." Day 280 blurred past in a montage of tears and confessions. She was crying on camera now, mascara streaking down her cheeks like war paint. "I'm healing from grief," she sobbed to her audience of strangers. "Learning to let go, learning to love myself again." Love herself. As if loving me had been some kind of burden she'd finally learned to set down. But it was day 365 that shattered me completely. She held up her left hand to the camera, and there, on the finger where my grandmother's ring used to live, was something new. Something that caught the light and threw it back in rainbow fragments that felt like mockery. "I said yes," she whispered to the screen, to the world, to everyone except the man she'd promised forever to. "I know some of you might think it's too soon, but the heart wants what it wants, right? The heart wants what it wants. As if love were nothing more than appetite, as if devotion could be satisfied by whatever was convenient, available, willing." My finger hesitated over the final video. The timestamp read day 730, exactly 2 years. The thumbnail showed rumpled sheets, morning light, her face flushed with something that definitely wasn't grief. I pressed play anyway, like picking at a wound that refused to heal. She was in bed, someone else's bed, I realized with sickening clarity, her hair spread across unfamiliar pillows. The camera was shaky, intimate, capturing her in a moment meant for someone else's eyes. "You know what's funny?" she whispered, her voice husky with sleep and satisfaction. "I think maybe I loved the idea of him more than the actual him, the coma version, anyway. The idea of him. As if I'd become nothing more than a concept, a memory she'd outgrown like childhood clothes." She laughed then, soft and content, and the sound destroyed something fundamental in my chest. Sometimes I wonder if this is what I was always meant to find, if everything that happened before was just practice. Practice. 2 years of marriage reduced to rehearsal for the real thing. 2 years of coma transformed into an intermission between her old life and her new one. I wanted to drop the phone, to hurl it against the wall and watch it shatter into as many pieces as my heart. Instead, I found myself pressing replay. Then again, each viewing carved the words deeper into my soul, each repetition hammering them into the foundation of who I was becoming. The machines around me beeped their mechanical sympathy, counting heartbeats that felt increasingly futile. Outside the window, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained gray, promising more storms to come. I replayed the video one more time, studying her face for traces of the woman who used to love me, but she was gone, replaced by someone who smiled brighter, laughed easier, loved simpler. Someone who had learned to treat forever like a rough draft, easily revised when a better story came along. The phone slipped from my hands like water, clattering to the floor with a finality that echoed in the silence of my hospital room. But the damage was done. Her words had taken root in the wasteland of my chest, growing into something dark and determined. She'd loved the idea of me, now I would show her the reality of what I'd become. Margaret looked older in the afternoon light that slanted through the hospital blinds, each ray revealing new lines etched into her face like a map of suffering I'd never bothered to read. She sat in the chair beside my bed, the same chair she'd occupied for 2 years, I realized with a sharp intake of breath, adjusting my blanket with the practiced care of someone who'd learned to love in the language of small gestures. "You sold your apartment," I said, the words emerging as statement rather than question. I'd seen it in her eyes, in the way she carried herself like someone who'd given up more than sleep and peace of mind. The designer handbag she used to carry had been replaced by something practical and worn. Her clothes were still nice but carefully maintained, the way people dress when every purchase becomes a calculation. She didn't deny it. Margaret had never been one for comfortable lies, not even when we were children, and I'd beg her to cover for my mischief. "The private nurses were expensive," she said simply, her fingers smoothing the edges of my blanket with the same methodical precision she'd once used to organize her law briefs. "Insurance only covered so much." While the woman I'd given my vows to had given her heart to a man who used to call me brother. The irony tasted like copper pennies and regret. "You never saw what I did," Margaret whispered, and her voice carried the weight of nights spent watching over a ghost, of days spent hoping for a miracle that everyone else had stopped believing in. She brought flowers for 3 months, roses at first, then carnations, then whatever was cheapest at the grocery store. I could picture it, my wife standing at my bedside with wilting petals, each visit shorter than the last, each bouquet smaller, cheaper, more perfunctory. Love measured in declining floral budgets. Then she stopped, Margaret continued, her hands never ceasing their gentle ministrations. "But I kept bringing you books, because I knew." Her voice cracked like ice under pressure. "I knew you'd come back. I knew you'd want to read about the world you'd missed." Books. While my wife was documenting her new life for strangers on the internet, my sister had been curating a library for my return. Stories to fill the gaps, words to bridge the chasm between who I'd been and who I was becoming. "The stack is in the corner," she said, nodding toward a tower of novels and memoirs and collections of poetry that reached almost to my shoulder. I read the first chapter of each one aloud, in case you could hear me. In case you could hear me. All those nights when I dreamed of voices calling my name, thinking it was my wife's desperate pleas pulling me back to consciousness. But it had been Margaret all along, reading me stories like I was still her little brother afraid of the dark. I didn't cry then, couldn't. The tears felt frozen somewhere behind my ribs, locked in ice that 2 years of unconsciousness had formed around my heart. But I reached for her hand, this woman who'd sacrificed her stability for my survival, and held it like a lifeline thrown across the wreckage of everything I'd believed about love and loyalty. Her fingers were thinner than I remembered, her wedding ring. She'd never married, never found time for her own love story between building her career and watching over her broken brother, loose on her finger. But her grip was steady, warm, present in a way that felt more real than anything else in this sterile world of machines and medical miracles. "I sold the apartment," she repeated, her voice stronger now, defiant almost. "And I'd do it again, 1,000 times, because family isn't about convenience, isn't about timing, isn't about whether someone's conscious enough to appreciate what you're doing for them." Family, the word hit me like electricity, sparking something in the darkness where hope used to live. Not the family I'd chosen, the wife who'd replaced me, the best friend who'd stolen her, but the family that had chosen me before I could even understand what choice meant. "You stayed," I whispered, the words scraping against my throat like prayer. "I stayed," she confirmed, squeezing my hand with gentle fierceness. "And I'll keep staying. For as long as you need me to." Outside the window, the sky was shifting from gray to deep purple, evening creeping in like a cautious cat. The machines around us hummed their mechanical lullabies, but for the first time since waking, the sound didn't feel like mockery, it felt like accompaniment to something sacred, the quiet music of unconditional love. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft from handling. "I wrote you letters too," she admitted, unfolding what looked like a journal page covered in her precise handwriting. "One every week, about what was happening in the world, about the cases I was working on, about how the seasons changed outside your window. Letters, real ones, written by hand, meant for no audience but me, not performed for cameras or curated for sympathy, just honest words from someone who'd never stopped believing I was worth waiting for. I may have been her ghost in everyone else's story, the tragic figure left behind, the burden abandoned, the inconvenient truth of love's limitations. But to Margaret, I'd always been flesh and blood and future, a man who would rise again if someone just had faith enough to keep the light on." And as I held her hand in that dimming room, surrounded by the evidence of her sacrifice and devotion, I made a promise that felt like resurrection. I may have been their ghost, haunting the edges of their happiness with my inconvenient survival. But I would rise in flesh, and when I did, the world would remember that some things, some people, refused to stay buried. The suit hung on me like armor-sized for the man I used to be. 2 years of hospital IVs and liquid nutrition had carved me down to something leaner, sharper, more dangerous. The fabric bunched at my shoulders and pulled at my ankles, but Margaret had insisted, "You need to look like the man who deserves justice, not the victim who needs pity." So I stood in the courthouse corridor, adjusting cuffs that no longer fit, breathing air that tasted like old wood and older lies. My legs still trembled from the effort of walking, but my spine, that essential core of who I was, remained unbent. She walked through the double doors like she owned the world, and perhaps she did now. Her skin held the golden kiss of a Caribbean honeymoon, her smile as bright and perfectly maintained as her fresh manicure. No remorse painted her features, no hesitation shadowed her steps. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone who'd never doubted her choices, never questioned her right to happiness at any cost. David followed a step behind, his hand possessive on the small of her back. He looked older too, but prosperity had been kinder to him than suffering had been to me. His suit fit perfectly, his tan matched hers, and when our eyes met across the mahogany divide, he had the grace to at least look away. "Your Honor," her lawyer began, his voice smooth as silk and twice as expensive, "my client was faced with an impossible situation. Her husband was medically unresponsive, with no guarantee of recovery. She waited a full year, well beyond what anyone could reasonably expect, before beginning to rebuild her life. Medically dead to her." The phrase hung in the air like smoke, choking me with its casual cruelty. I'd been reduced to a medical condition, a problem to be solved or abandoned as circumstances warranted. "My client," my lawyer countered, his voice carrying the weight of righteous fur. I couldn't yet summon, was legally alive throughout his coma. His wife's abandonment and subsequent remarriage constitute abandonment and adultery, making her ineligible for any claim to marital assets. Legally alive. The words felt like a victory, small but sharp. I may have been absent, but I had never been absent without rights. I didn't speak much during the proceedings, couldn't trust my voice not to crack, couldn't risk the tremor that still lived in my hands from months of stillness. Instead, I reached into the briefcase Margaret had prepared and withdrew a small silver USB drive, no bigger than my thumb but containing enough poison to kill a marriage retroactively. "I'd like to submit this as evidence," my lawyer announced, holding the drive up to catch the light. "Video documentation of the defendant's emotional state and decision-making process during the period in question." Her face changed then. The confident mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw and panicked underneath. She leaned forward to whisper frantically to her lawyer, her perfectly manicured nails scratching against the polished table like a cat trying to find purchase on glass. But it was too late. The judge had already accepted the evidence, and within minutes, her voice was filling the courtroom through the sound system. That bright, chirping voice I'd once loved, now transformed into the narrator of my betrayal. "Day 82, he's still not waking up, but I have to keep living." The courtroom was silent except for the mechanical whir of the recording device. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen over the keys as if afraid to document what came next. Day 143. "I went out tonight. My therapist says I need to reconnect with joy." Day 280, Day 365, Day 730. Each timestamp another nail in the coffin of her credibility, each confession another year stripped from the marriage she'd claimed to honor until death parted us. I think maybe I loved the idea of him more than the actual him, the coma version anyway. Her lawyer's objections came too late, too desperate. The words were already etched into the court record, burned into the consciousness of everyone present. She'd convicted herself with her own voice, her own words, her own careless honesty performed for an audience that had never included me. The judge raised an eyebrow, a single, eloquent arch that spoke volumes about his opinion of women who documented their adultery for public consumption. This is quite comprehensive documentation of the defendant's mental state. She flinched then. Actually flinched, her body recoiling as if the judge's words were physical blows. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been recognition, or regret, or simply the belated understanding that actions have consequences even when you think no one's watching. And I inhaled. For the first time in 2 years, for the first time since waking up to find my life stolen and my love redistributed, I drew breath without feeling like I was drowning. The air tasted like justice, sharp and clean and full of possibilities I'd forgotten existed. The machines had kept me breathing while I slept, but this moment when truth finally had a void, and lies finally had consequences, this was the first breath I'd taken as a man reborn. Outside the courthouse windows, the sky was breaking open with the first real sunlight I'd seen since waking. And for the first time since learning that love could expire like milk left too long in the sun, I smiled. Not because I was happy, not because the pain had lessened or the betrayal had been erased, but because I was no longer the ghost haunting the edges of their happiness. I was flesh and blood and fury, standing in a courtroom where truth mattered more than convenience, where vows had weight and promises had power. I was alive, finally, completely, dangerously alive. And they would never be able to bury me again. The key turned in the lock with the same metallic whisper it always had, but the sound echoed differently now, hollow, like a voice calling into an empty cathedral. I pushed open the door to what used to be our home, and the scent hit me like a physical blow. Her perfume still lingered in the air, clinging to the walls and furniture like a ghost refusing to be exorcised. Chanel No. 5. The same fragrance she'd worn on our first date, our wedding day, every anniversary until there were no more anniversaries to celebrate. Now it felt like breathing in the memory of betrayal, sweet and suffocating and wrong. I stepped inside, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the hardwood floors we'd chosen together during those early days when forever felt possible. The apartment looked smaller somehow, as if my absence had allowed it to contract around itself, shrinking to fit a life that no longer included me. The photos still hung on the walls where we'd placed them, but they were crooked now, tilted at angles that spoke of careless packing, of someone who'd grabbed what mattered and left the rest to hang askew. Our wedding portrait, once the centerpiece above the mantel, had been replaced by an empty frame, its golden borders surrounding nothing but wall paint and the faint outline of what used to be. She had taken it. Of course she had. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd stolen the photo but left the frame, as if she could extract the memory without acknowledging the foundation it had been built on, like she could cut me out of the picture while keeping the pretty borders intact. I touched the empty frame with fingers that still remembered the tremor of hospital beds and IV needles. The glass was cold, reflecting back a distorted version of my face, thinner now, marked by suffering she'd never bothered to witness. In the reflection, I could see the ghost of our younger selves, the couple who'd hung that photo with such ceremony, such hope. They'd been fools, beautiful, naive fools who'd believed in forever. Behind me, the apartment stretched out like a museum of abandoned dreams. Her coffee cup still sat in the sink, lipstick stain on the rim like a kiss goodbye she'd never bothered to give me. The books we'd shared were gone from the shelves, leaving gaps like missing teeth in a smile that no longer knew how to form. I moved through the rooms methodically, packing boxes with the mechanical precision of someone performing surgery on his own life. Each item I touched carried weight, not physical, but emotional. The sweater she'd bought me for Christmas 2 years ago, still unworn in its drawer. The watch that had stopped keeping time the day of the accident and never been repaired. Fragments of a man who'd existed before machines kept him breathing. Box after box filled with the detritus of love. Books with margins full of her handwriting, CDs we'd danced to in the kitchen when the world was young, ticket stubs from movies we'd seen in the weeks before everything ended. I packed them all with the same neutral efficiency, refusing to let sentiment slow the amputation of this life from my soul. It was in the bedroom that I found it, tucked between the pages of a notebook she'd left behind, probably forgotten in her haste to erase me from her narrative. A piece of paper, folded small and worn soft from handling. Her handwriting sprawled across it in the blue ink she'd always preferred, words that looked like they'd been written and rewritten, torn up and smoothed out again. I don't know how to love someone who's not awake. The note trembled in my hands as I read it again, then again. A confession never sent, an honesty never shared. She'd written the truth, that love, for her, required consciousness, presence, the ability to participate in the performance of affection. That comatose devotion was beyond her capacity. At least she'd known herself well enough to be honest on paper, even if she'd never found the courage to be honest with me. I laughed then, low and bitter, the sound scraping against my throat like broken glass. The laughter filled the empty apartment, echoing off walls that had once heard different sounds, her voice singing in the shower, our conversations late into the night, the whispered promises we'd made in darkness. But those sounds belonged to ghosts now, and I was done being haunted. I walked to the paper shredder in what used to be our home office, the machine Margaret had bought me for organizing important documents. The note fed into the teeth with a satisfying mechanical whir, her confession transformed into confetti that fluttered into the wastebasket like snow at a funeral. Because I didn't need her love anymore. Had never needed the conditional, fragile thing she'd called love, dependent on my ability to perform consciousness for her comfort. I needed closure, and closure wasn't about forgiveness or understanding or any of the pretty lies people told themselves about moving on. Closure was about choosing what deserved to be read and what deserved to be shredded into pieces too small to hurt anymore. The apartment fell silent around me, empty now of everything except the echo of my own footsteps and the faint, fading scent of a perfume I would never smell again without remembering this moment. The moment I stopped being her ghost and started becoming my own man. Months passed like pages turning in a book I was finally learning to read. Physical therapy became a meditation, each step a small victory over the body that had betrayed me into stillness. I learned to walk again, not with the unconscious grace I'd once taken for granted, but with the deliberate purpose of someone who understood that every movement was a choice, every breath a small rebellion against the darkness I'd escaped. The mirror in my new apartment reflected a different man than the one who'd been wheeled out of the hospital. Leaner, yes, but stronger too. The softness that 2 years of immobility had carved away had been replaced by something harder, more essential. I'd been reduced to my core elements and rebuilt from there, molecule by molecule, heartbeat by heartbeat. I learned to smile again, not the automatic expression I'd worn in my previous life, but something more intentional. Smiles earned through small victories, walking to the corner store without assistance, cooking a meal without trembling hands, sleeping through the night without dreaming of machines. The physical therapist said I was making remarkable progress. Margaret said I seemed lighter somehow, despite the weight of everything I'd lost, but I knew the truth. I wasn't healing from my injuries, I was healing from her. The message came on a Tuesday, sliding into my phone like a knife wrapped in silk. Just 3 words glowing on my screen. Hope you're healing. Her name attached to those words like a signature on a document I'd never signed. After months of silence, after building a life carefully constructed to exclude her existence, she'd reached across the void with casual concern packaged as kindness. Hope you're healing, as if my recovery were something she had a right to monitor, as if her abandonment had been a necessary medicine rather than poison. I stared at the message for longer too. It deserved, watching the cursor blink in the reply field like a heartbeat counting seconds I would never get back. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, composing and deleting responses that ranged from fury to forgiveness, from detailed explanations of what healing actually looked like to silence that spoke louder than words. Finally, I typed 2 words. I did. Nothing more, nothing less. No explanation of what healing meant, the months of learning to trust my own body again, the nights spent building dreams that didn't include her, the mornings when I woke up grateful instead of grieving. Just acknowledgement that the process she'd hoped for had been completed without her input, her concern, or her presence. I hit send before I could second-guess the simplicity of truth. Her response came within minutes, a string of messages that tumbled over each other in their eagerness to reclaim relevance in my story. Questions about how I was doing, suggestions that we might talk sometime, casual mentions of mutual friends, as if we still shared a social ecosystem. I deleted them all, without reading past the first few words. The real test came weeks later, when my phone buzzed with a notification I'd almost forgotten was possible. She'd tagged me in a post, one of those carefully curated anniversary memories that social media algorithms dredged up like archaeological evidence of happiness. "Look how far we've come," the caption read, accompanied by a carousel of photos documenting her journey from grieving widow to blushing bride. There were pictures I'd never seen, her in therapy, her learning to smile again, her discovering new love with the man who used to call me brother. A narrative of healing that positioned my coma as the beginning of her story rather than the interruption of ours. The final photo showed her and David on their honeymoon, sun-kissed and radiant, raising champagne flutes to celebrate how far they'd traveled from the tragedy that had brought them together. She'd tagged me in it, made me a character in her redemption story, the darkness she'd emerged from into the light of new love. I reported it. Not out of spite, though spite lived in me now like a loyal pet I'd learned to feed carefully, but because healing wasn't letting people rewrite history to make their choices seem noble. Healing wasn't allowing yourself to be cast as the prologue to someone else's happy ending. Healing was owning your side of the story, scars and all, truth and all, pain transformed into power instead of bitterness buried in false forgiveness. And my story wasn't romantic, it wasn't about love conquering all, or fate bringing people together through tragedy. It wasn't about silver linings or everything happening for a reason, or any of the pretty lies people told to make suffering seem meaningful. My story was about survival, about learning to breathe without machines, to walk without assistance, to love without conditions or expiration dates. It was about discovering that the man who woke up from the coma was stronger than the one who'd fallen into it, not despite what had been taken from him, but because of what he'd chosen to build from the wreckage. The notification disappeared from my timeline, erased as efficiently as she'd once tried to erase me from hers. But unlike her attempts at revision, mine was final. I was no longer available to be the ghost in her story of transformation. I was too busy being the hero of my own. The book in her hand stopped me mid-step, coffee growing cold against my palm as recognition hit like lightning. The Unbearable Lightness of Being, Kundera's meditation on memory and meaning, weight and weightlessness. I'd read it 3 times in my previous life, the margins filled with notes in handwriting that belonged to a man who'd believed in the permanence of love. She sat by the window where October light painted everything gold and gentle, her dark hair falling like a curtain between her face and the world. But when she sensed my staring, that peculiar awareness that exists between strangers who recognize something essential in each other, she looked up, and our eyes met across the small space of the Rehabilitation Center Cafe. Her eyes were brown, but not the warm brown of earth or chocolate that poets favored. These were the brown of strong coffee, of autumn leaves just before they fell, of things that had survived their own burning. There was something in her gaze that spoke of professional compassion tempered by personal understanding, the look of someone who'd seen suffering up close and learned to carry it without drowning. I should have looked away, should have taken my physical therapy appointment and my carefully reconstructed life, and continued the measured progress toward whatever normal was supposed to look like now. Instead, I found myself walking toward her table, drawn by something I couldn't name and wasn't sure I trusted. "Kundera," I said, nodding toward the book. "Heavy reading for a Tuesday afternoon." She smiled, not the bright, performative expression I'd grown to distrust, but something smaller, more honest. "I find his heaviness comforting," she said, closing the book but keeping her finger between the pages to mark her place. "There's something reassuring about a writer who doesn't pretend life is light. You're not afraid of weight then?" "No," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that made me understand she wasn't just talking about philosophy. "I'm a trauma nurse. Weight is part of the job description." Trauma nurse, someone who specialized in the aftermath of catastrophe, who made her living in the space between life and death where I'd spent 2 years as an unwilling resident. But instead of the pity I'd grown accustomed to seeing in medical professionals' eyes when they learned my story, hers held only calm recognition. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, gesturing toward the empty chair across from her. "Please." We didn't talk about comas or heartbreak, though both hung in the air between us like smoke from fires we'd both learned to tend. Instead, we talked about the chapters that came after the crisis, the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding that never made it into the dramatic narratives people preferred. The movies always end at the wrong place, she said, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm while we talked. They show the dramatic recovery, the triumphant moment when someone wakes up or walks again or finds love. But they never show the months of learning to trust your own body again, the way you have to rebuild not just physically but emotionally. The messy parts, I agreed. The parts where healing looks less like victory and more like showing up every day to do the work nobody sees. Exactly. She leaned forward slightly, and I caught the faint scent of lavender, not perfume, but soap, something practical and clean. The quiet parts where you discover who you are when nobody's watching, when there's no audience for your recovery. Her name was Elena, and she'd spent 5 years working in the ICU before transferring to the rehabilitation wing. She'd seen people wake up to worlds that had moved on without them, had watched families fracture under the weight of long-term CER, had learned to recognize the difference between healing and merely surviving. Sometimes, she said as afternoon light shifted through the window, painting new shadows across her face, the people who stay with you through the worst parts aren't the ones you expected, and sometimes the ones you thought would never leave are the first ones out the door. I thought of Margaret, counting my breaths for 2 years while my wife counted days until freedom. Experience talking? Always. She smiled again, and this time there was something almost rueful in it. I've never been married, never had anyone in a coma, but I've seen enough bedside vigils to know that love under pressure reveals things about people they might have spent their whole lives not knowing about themselves. We talked until the cafe began to empty, until the golden light faded to purple twilight, and the cleaning crew started stacking chairs. When she finally closed her book completely and gathered her things, I felt something I hadn't experienced in so long I almost didn't recognize it, the reluctance of ending a conversation that had fed something hungry in my soul. Same time next week? She asked, slipping the kundera into a worn leather bag. I'm here every Tuesday for continuing education seminars. Same time next week, I confirmed, and meant it in a way that surprised me with its certainty. Walking home through streets lit by street lamps and early stars, I realized something had shifted during those hours of conversation. I hadn't fallen in love. Falling implied accident, gravity, loss of control. What had happened felt more intentional, more deliberate. I had risen into something that might become love, the kind built on understanding rather than passion, on recognition rather than possession. The kind where touch would mean presence rather than ownership, where silence would feel like safety rather than abandonment. For the first time since waking up to find my old life stolen, I felt something that resembled hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope of my hospital days, but something steadier, the hope of someone who'd learned that the best chapters often began after the worst ones ended. The hope of someone ready to discover what came next. The cursor blinked against the white page like a heartbeat, steady and patient, waiting for me to find words that could carry the weight of resurrection. I'd been staring at the blank document for an hour, coffee growing cold at my elbow, but the opening sentence felt too important to rush. This wasn't just writing, it was alchemy, the transformation of pain into purpose. I woke up to a world that had forgotten how to wait. The words appeared on the screen as if they'd written themselves, and suddenly the floodgates opened. The article poured out of me in a torrent of truth I'd been carrying like poison in my chest, each paragraph a surgical extraction of everything I'd learned about love and loyalty, abandonment and renewal. I wrote about waking up to strangers in scrubs and empty spaces where promises used to live, about learning that some people's forever had expiration dates written in fine print, about the difference between being medically dead and being emotionally erased, between comas that ended and marriages that didn't survive the waiting. But mostly, I wrote about the after. The unglamorous, undramatic work of rebuilding not just a body but a soul, of learning to breathe again when the machine stopped doing it for you, of discovering that the man who emerged from unconsciousness could be stronger than the one who'd fallen into it. The magazine that published it, a small literary journal with a circulation that barely reached 5 figures, probably saved my life in ways the hospital never could. Because within hours of publication, my inbox began filling with messages from people who'd lived in the same liminal space between life and death, between love and abandonment. Stories poured in from family members who'd held vigils that lasted years, from spouses who'd chosen to stay when staying felt impossible, from patients who'd woken up to find their worlds rearranged without their consent. Each message was a thread in a tapestry I hadn't known existed, a community of the left behind, the forgotten, the discarded. The book deal came 6 months later, born from an agent who'd read the article and recognized the hunger for stories that didn't end with neat resolutions and Hollywood healing. After The Machines, a memoir of waking up became my attempt to map the territory between tragedy and recovery, to give voice to everyone who'd ever been reduced to a medical condition in someone else's love story. The writing process was archaeological, each chapter an excavation of memories I'd buried, emotions I'd fossilized for survival. But with each word, I felt something loosening in my chest, the calcified grief that had been growing around my heart, like coral finally beginning to dissolve. The podcast followed naturally, weekly conversations with other survivors, other caregivers, other people who'd learned that love wasn't always enough and that sometimes not being enough was a gift in disguise. We talked about the practical realities of long-term care, the ethics of medical decision-making, the way society commodified suffering and packaged recovery into digestible narratives that bore no resemblance to the messy truth. But mostly, we talked about what came after. The part that nobody wanted to hear about, the slow, unglamorous work of building new lives from the wreckage of old ones, of learning to measure success in heartbeats and breaths and days when hope felt stronger than despair. The audience grew slowly, organically, person by person and story by story. Hospital social workers recommended episodes to families facing impossible decisions. Support groups played segments during their meetings. Medical schools began incorporating the podcast into their curricula, using our conversations to teach empathy alongside anatomy. I was reading reviews on a Thursday morning when I saw her name in the comments section, glowing on my laptop screen like a ghost materializing in daylight. Her profile picture showed her and David on some tropical beach, their smiles as bright and empty as magazine advertisements for happiness. "So proud to see where this journey has led," she'd written, her words dripping with the kind of false intimacy that made my skin crawl. "Always knew you had important stories to tell." Always knew, as if she'd been some kind of prophet of my potential, instead of the person who'd abandoned me when storytelling meant nothing more than monitoring machines and counting days until giving up felt justified. I blocked her without hesitation, deleted the comment before it could pollute the space I'd built for truth-telling. Because some legacies were built from pain, transformed into purpose through the alchemy of survival, and not everyone deserved to claim credit for the phoenix that rose from ashes they'd helped create. The book climbed bestseller lists not because it was sensational, but because it was honest, because it refused to transform suffering into inspiration porn, refused to pretend that everything happened for a reason, or that love conquered all. It succeeded because it told the truth about what it meant to lose everything, and then discover that everything wasn't actually lost, it was just hidden beneath layers of other people's expectations and definitions. Elena read it before anyone else, curled up beside me in the apartment we had begun to share, her presence a quiet counterpoint to the storm of words I'd unleashed upon the world. She didn't offer critique or praise, just the gift of witness, someone who understood that some stories needed to be told not for their beauty, but for their necessity. "You've given them something they didn't know they needed," she said, closing the final chapter as dawn painted our bedroom windows gold. "Permission to survive messily. Permission to survive messily." That became the unofficial motto of the community that grew around the work, people who'd learned that healing wasn't linear, that recovery wasn't always complete, that sometimes the most radical thing you could do was keep breathing when the world suggested you'd outlived your usefulness. The speaking engagements, the interviews, the academic conferences, all of it grew from that first blank page, that first decision to transform poison into medicine. And with each platform, each audience, each person who approached me afterward with tears in their eyes and stories in their hearts, I understood that this was why I'd survived. Not to forgive or forget or find closure in the pretty packages society preferred, but to build something from the wreckage that could shelter other people caught in similar storms. To prove that some legacies couldn't be touched by the people who'd tried to bury you. They belonged to the person you became after you learned to breathe again. The hill rose above the city like a promise kept, its slope gentle enough for legs that still remembered the tremor of hospital beds, but steep enough to remind me that every step forward was a choice. Below us, the urban sprawl stretched toward horizons painted purple and gold by the setting sun, a million lights beginning to flicker like stars brought down to earth. This wasn't a hospital room with its sterile walls and mechanical lullabies. This wasn't a courtroom where truth had to be proven with evidence and testimony. This was a place of my choosing, a piece of earth I'd claimed through the simple act of standing upon it, breathing freely in air that belonged to no one but the sky. Elena stood beside me, her presence as steady and essential as gravity. 3 years had passed since that first conversation over kundera and cold coffee, 3 years of learning that love could be rebuilt from different materials than I'd originally thought. Not the desperate, clinging thing I'd once called love, that frantic need for possession disguised as devotion, but something quieter, more durable. She'd stayed through the difficult days of memoir writing, when excavating buried memories had left me raw and sleepless. She'd listened to podcast recordings where I'd interviewed people whose stories made mine seem simple by comparison. She'd watched me build a career from the wreckage of my old life and never once suggested I owe her gratitude for the privilege of witnessing my resurrection. Most importantly, she'd stayed not because she'd promised to, not because vows bound her to weather whatever storms came, but because she'd chosen to. Every morning, she chose to build our life together. Every evening, she chose to come home to the man I was becoming rather than mourning the man I'd never been. "Nervous?" she asked, her voice carrying on the wind that swept up from the valley below. "Whoa." In her other hand, she held the small velvet box that had been burning a hole in my jacket pocket for weeks, waiting for this moment, this place, this breath of courage. Terrified, I admitted, and felt the honesty of it settle into my bones like music. "But not of what you think." She raised an eyebrow, inviting explanation with the gesture that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. "I'm not afraid you'll say no," I continued, watching the way sunlight caught the gold in her brown eyes. "I'm not afraid of marriage or commitment or any of the traditional fears. I'm afraid of how good this feels, how right. After everything that went wrong before, I'm terrified of trusting happiness." Elena smiled, not the bright, performative expression I'd learned to distrust, but the quiet, honest thing she did when truth passed between us like a sacrament. "Good," she said. "Fear means you're paying attention, means you understand what you're choosing." What I was choosing, not what fate had handed me or what circumstances had demanded, but what I was actively, consciously deciding to build with my own hands and heart and hope. I took the box from her fingers and sank to one knee on the hilltop, the grass soft beneath me, the city spread out below like a blessing, but I didn't look at the urban landscape or the painted sky or any of the scenic beauty that surrounded us. I looked at Elena, this woman who'd taught me the difference between falling and rising, between needing and choosing, between love as desperation and love as deliberate act of faith. "I used to breathe for someone else," I said, my voice carrying across the evening air like prayer. "Lived for their approval, their happiness, their version of what love should look like. I measured my worth by how well I could disappear into someone else's story, how completely I could surrender my own needs to service theirs." The box opened with a soft click, revealing the ring I'd chosen, simple, elegant, but strong enough to last through whatever storms might come. Not my grandmother's ring, not something inherited from a previous life, but something new, purchased with money I'd earned from transforming my pain into purpose. "But you taught me something I'd never learned before," I continued, my eyes never leaving hers. "You taught me that the strongest love comes from two whole people choosing each other, not from broken people trying to complete themselves through someone else." Above us, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, distant suns burning their own light across impossible distances. Like us, I thought, separate but choosing to shine together, each maintaining our own fire while illuminating shared space. "Elena Maria Santos," I said, speaking her full name like an incantation, "will you marry me? Will you choose to build a life where neither of us has to disappear? Where love means seeing each other clearly and choosing each other anyway?" Her answer came not in words, but in action, in the way she dropped to her knees beside me on the hilltop, in the way her hands cupped my face like something precious, in the kiss that tasted like promises made without expiration dates. "Yes," she whispered against my lips, the word carried away by wind that felt like benedicti. "On. Yes, to all of it, to choosing each other, to staying conscious, to breathing together instead of for each other." I slipped the ring onto her finger as the sun finished its descent behind the horizon, marking the end of one day and the beginning of something entirely new. The metal caught the last light like a small sun, a circle with no beginning and no end, but plenty of space for two people to choose each other again, and again, and again. Standing together on that hilltop with the city spread below us, and stars beginning their ancient dance above, I closed my eyes and took the deepest breath of my life. Air filled my lungs completely, cleanly, without the assistance of machines or the weight of other people's expectations. I used to breathe for someone else, I whispered into the gathering darkness. Now I breathe for me. Elena's hand found mine, fingers interlacing like roots growing toward the same source of light. And that was the first real step, not away from the past that had shaped me, but toward the future I was finally ready to choose. Not as a ghost haunting someone else's happiness, not as a victim of circumstances beyond my control, but as a man who'd learned to love consciously, breathe freely, and build his own version of forever, one deliberate choice at a time. The machines had kept me alive when I couldn't do it myself, but this breath, this moment, this was mine. And I was finally, completely, eternally awake.